Hi, everybody. Sorry for the technical difficulties. It's the red button with the X on it. You should unmute. You'd think I have that down by now. I am Chet Seward with a grin on my face. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at the Colorado Medical Society. Thanks for your patience, folks online. Forgive us. We're really happy you're here tonight, not only virtually, but folks here in the room for this incredible discussion about what we can learn from the Nazi medical crimes presented by the Holocaust, Genocide, and Contemporary Bioethics Program, the Center for Bioethics and Humanities, U Anschutz campus, and of course by us at CMS. But our great partners there are bringing you this program. We are very, very privileged. Welcome visiting professor, Dr. Volker Roelcke, who brings exceptional expertise to this challenging topic. Dr. Roelcke holds both an MD from Heidelberg University and a PhD in the history of medicine from Bonn University, combining clinical knowledge and deep historical scholarship. As the current chair of the Institute of the History of Medicine at Gießen University in Germany, Dr. Roelcke has dedicated much of his distinguished career to examining medicine during the Nazi period and its aftermath. Tonight's presentation will explore how ethical medical professionals became complicit in systemic harm and why understanding this history remains our strongest defense against future atrocities. As we continue to face complex ethical challenges from COVID controversies to ongoing debates about research ethics, Dr. Roelcke's insights provide valuable perspectives for healthcare professionals and the broader community. We'd like to extend a special thanks to Bill Silvers for supporting this programming through his endowment for the Holocaust, Genocide, and Contemporary Bioethics Program at the Center for Bioethics and Humanities. After Dr. Roelcke finishes his talk, our great friend, Dr. Matt Winia, will moderate a Q&A session. So folks online, you know the Zoom drill, I bet. Audio and chat are off, so please share your questions via the Q&A functionality on Zoom. Closed captioning, of course, is also available at the bottom of your screen. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Volker Roelcke for what promises to be a thought-provoking examination of the enduring lessons from this difficult chapter in medical history. Please.
Thank you very much for this very friendly introduction. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak here. Also, thanks to Matwinia and Lisa Colhane from the Center for Bioethics and Humanities who support this ability of this talk. Well, okay, sorry. So I want to start with the November 2023 launch of the Lancet Commission on Medicine, Nazism, and the Holocaust. Many of you may have heard of that or read about this. This Lancet Commission was published in the journal The Lancet with the following words on the cover of the issue. Okay. So on the cover of the issue there, it was said that what happened under the Nazi regime has far-reaching implications for the health professions today, and virtually about health professional ethics can gain from an understanding of this shameful history. So here is the cover of the Lancet. So what exactly are the implications of this history for today? To answer this question, I shall start by presenting a very short interpretation of what happened on the basis of the available historical evidence, sort of as a guiding idea for my further presentation. Then, in the second step, I shall present a summary of the historical evidence on that period. After that, I will come to the post-war period, describe three types of behavior patterns by individual physicians and also professional medical bodies in the post-World War II period in response to Nazi medical atrocities, which are in themselves quite interesting and instructive for our questions. And in the last part, I shall describe 3 basic ethical codes and declarations.
I'm in trouble hearing you online.
Okay. Is it better?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Shall I start again or? No. Okay. So in the last part of the presentation, I shall describe 3 basic ethical codes or declarations formulated in response to medical atrocities during the Nazi period. Well, first, my tentative interpretation on the basis of the available historical evidence, which might be surprising for some of you. What happened in medicine during the Nazi period was not specific for this period, but I would argue it was rather a particularly extreme and radical manifestation of problematic potentials inherent in modern medicine in general. I think this might be irritating, but I will give you the evidence for this claim in the following. Starting from this interpretation, I mean, if you accept this first of all, try to accept it. If we look at this historical case like this, we may use the evidence of the historical case to study problematic potentials of modern medicine, which are ubiquitous, but which came to an extreme manifestation during the Nazi period, such as the mechanisms and dynamics of opportunism and the abuse of power, which are not specific for the Nazi period, but there you can see them in a very dramatic and excessive way. You can see the rise, dynamics, and intrinsic pitfalls of problematic value hierarchies. Okay. Okay. So one of the other problematic issues which we can study in this case is the rise, dynamics, and intrinsic pitfalls of problematic value hierarchies, such as the priority of the collective good compared to the individual good, which we have in a very extreme manifestation in that period. But as you know from public health debates and also from the COVID pandemic and so on, we have this question how to balance this collective good versus individual good. We have that all the time in medicine and public health. This kind of dynamics and the intrinsic pitfalls in this historical case. We also can study the rise and intrinsic dangers of medical or biological interpretations of social phenomena and also biological interpretations of social groups, what I want to call biologization of social facts, like the biologization of reproduction rates of populations, the biological interpretations of epidemiological data, and also the biological framing of populations, such as in the term races, and so on. So all these points and issues may be sort of studied, which are sort of ubiquitous, I think, in modern medicine, but they can be studied in this historic case in a particularly extreme expression or manifestation. Well, now let's turn to the historical evidence itself, and I go through the subtopics, if you want, or chapters in this history of the medicine during the Nazi period in a chronological order, more or less. So the first thing, the first questions and issues which you can see there after the Nazis came to power, and it should perhaps be stressed that the Nazis came to power, Hitler and the Nazi Party, after an election and some formally legal parliamentary procedures. So this was not a military coup or something like that, but it was sort of formally correct procedures in a situation which was still sort of governed by a democratic constitution. I think this is some interesting point to think about even today. So once they were in power in 1933, first of all, together with some other very conservative parties, which they managed to outmaneuver, they started the process of what in German is called Gleichschaltung, a very special term coined by them, but maybe translated as systematic coordination of medical institutions and associations according to the Führerprinzip, the principle of the Führer, which meant that this was a complete top-down organization instead of the formerly sort of existing bottom-up organization of medical organizations. They were organized according to democratic principles in the preceding Weimar Republic. We then can see the stigmatization, the dismissal from public offices, the forced migration, and finally also the systematic extermination of physicians defined as Jewish or as politically unreliable. This referred to socialists, for instance. And I use this somehow complicated formulation, defined as Jewish, because the Nazis created a new definition, who is Jewish. So quite a lot of people who didn't consider themselves as Jewish, they were Catholics, Protestants, or not interested in religion, they were suddenly confronted with the fact that the Nazis categorized them as Jewish because they had Jewish parents, grandparents, or whatever. So the number of Jews suddenly expanded quite rapidly. And all these people defined as Jews or as politically unreliable, sometimes it was overlapping, they were immediately more or less kicked out of their public offices, like in university medical schools or in municipal hospitals, and so on and so on. And there was an escalating process of persecution, which led to the migration of many of the Jewish physicians, but not all of them, and finally to the systematic deportation and extermination of these people, and as it happened to all of those who were defined as Jewish. Well, the next point we can see there is the immediate start of a very strong public rhetoric of strengthening the folk body. And here we can see the biological terminology used. The population was framed as an organism, the so-called Volkskörper or folk body, and it should be strengthened, like build up. And so in the weak ones in this population were seen as sort of an obstacle in this process of strengthening the Volks body, so they should be got rid of. And this was also framed in with the terminology of hygiene, an existing medical field, but it was argued that this is hygiene of the race. So again, sort of a biological framing of the population, and and the whole thing was called racial hygiene. But this term was not invented; it was pre-existing. It was not invented by the Nazis. I come back to that. And we also see something very interesting, which is interesting also for medical ethicists or bioethicists, that medical ethics, or as it was at that time mostly called deontology, the teaching about the duties of the physician, were introduced as an obligatory subject in all medical curricula, on all medical German medical schools. So that might be surprising. It was a very, very early introduction of medical ethics in the curriculum. And it shows us that teaching medical ethics or bioethics is not in itself sort of a means to prevent misbehavior, misconduct, and so on, and atrocities. So it depends on what kind of medical ethics is taught, for instance. And here we have a very specific kind of medical ethics, which clearly and very explicitly prioritized the collective good versus the individual good. So this all happened within the first years of the regime. And then beyond this rhetoric and this introduction of medical ethics in the curricula and also introduction of racial hygiene into the curricula, we see a policy and practices, related practices to into practice this sort of idea of racial hygiene. We could call that health and population policies and practices aimed at biologically cleaning and strengthening the Volkskörper, the folk body. So this started immediately in 1933, 1934, and it continued all the way through the end of the war. So there are two big programs to do this strengthening of the folk body. The first program, which was based on a law which was already passed in mid-1933 on the initiative of physicians, actually. It was not invented by the Nazis. So it was a law for forced sterilization. It was inspired by eugenics, a much broader program of improving populations, genetically improving populations. It was called the Law for the Prevention of Hereditarily Ill Offspring. And as I said, it was initiated by physicians and medical organizations. And it was, interestingly, modeled on already existing laws, sterilization laws, eugenically motivated sterilization laws, which existed in a number of US states. And it was also based on a draft sterilization law, which originated in the democratic Weimar Republic, so prior to the Nazi period. So it's not specific, this law, for the Nazi period, but again, as I said in the very beginning, in the Nazi context, it was executed in a very extreme and radical way. And what also has to be said that the victims of this law, those who were sterilized, which were about between 350 and 400,000 individuals, they were diagnosed by physicians as suffering from hereditary disorders. So they were not labeled as ill by politicians, but by physicians, and physicians who were trained in hereditary pathology, what perhaps today we would call medical genetics. So this was the first program, which continued from 1933, 1934 to the end of the regime. And the second very big and even more dramatic and atrocious program was the systematic killing, or so-called euthanasia, of 250,000 to 300,000 psychiatric patients and mentally handicapped individuals. This started in 1939, more or less together with the war, and this was not based on an official law, but it was tried to implement that in secrecy, which didn't work completely. Again, this killing of patients and mentally handicapped individuals was initiated by physicians, actually. It was implemented by the state in cooperation with physicians, but those who were killed had before been diagnosed or labeled, perhaps better to be said, labeled as life unworthy of living by physicians. There were three kinds of programs for that, and sort of more elaborated kind of evaluation related for children. This was a program of child euthanasia, which started already in 1939 and went through to 1945. And since the regime was very much interested in principle in having children, so they were very careful in deciding that children should be killed, but they did kill after a more elaborate kind of evaluation. In contrast to the second program, which is the so-called program Aktion T4, T4 because of Tiergartenstraße. Here, the address of the central office for this killing program in Berlin. So this was the internal code for this killing program. And this was a very centralized program with a very short evaluation of patients in asylums. And those who evaluated the patients were physicians, in part even professors of psychiatry. But in 95% of the cases, they didn't see the patients. They just did it on sort of on the basis of patient files and patient information they got from the asylums. These patients who were identified as unworthy of living by physicians, just on the basis of this paperwork, they were deported from the asylums and taken to 6 central killing centers distributed over the German Reich, in northern Germany, southeastern Germany, westeastern Germany, and so on. And these were psychiatric asylums which had been converted into killing centers by establishing gas chambers in the cellars. This was before the gas chambers in the concentration camps, and also crematoria to burn the cadavers after the killing. So in this context, there were about 70,000 patients and mentally handicapped individuals killed. This program was stopped in 1941 for reasons which I can't go into detail now because of the limited time. But the killings still went on in a more decentralized fashion. And now in this decentralized program, killing program, the decisions were taken locally in the asylums by physicians, sometimes in cooperation with the nurses. And the patients were killed in many of the asylums in all the German Reich. So altogether, in the German territories and also in the occupied territories in Eastern Europe, we'll probably have roughly between 250 and 300,000 victims of this killing program. And this is not the Holocaust. It's not in the big camps, the concentration camps, but it was in medical contexts, in asylums, and carried through by physicians and initiated by physicians. And it was carried through after a kind of diagnosis or labeling of the victims as unworthy of living by physicians. I think it's important to see that it's different from the Holocaust, but there are some kind of connections between the two programs, the Holocaust, which perhaps in the discussion we can go into that. Well, the next chapter in this history, also in the period from 1939 to 1945, is the abuse of individuals for medical research and teaching. So there was forced medical research in what I want to call deregulated spaces. Why deregulated spaces? Because perhaps contrary to your intuition, there existed regulation for human subject research, and it was fairly protective for the individuals, for the research subjects. And we have lots of sort of indicators that physicians kept to these regulations as long as it was the research subjects were proper Germans. But if there existed spaces which had been created in this Nazi context, in particular concentration camp, created by the regime, but also other spaces like the psychiatric asylums and also Jewish hospitals in the occupied territories in Eastern Europe, where these regulations could be ignored by physicians. The physicians knew that. There was no explicit decree or something which said, here you can ignore that. No, but physicians knew that there they could do whatever they found sensible, what they wanted to do for their research. So a colleague of us in Oxford has set up a database, and he has come to the conclusion that there might have been about 29,000 victims of this kind of forced medical research. Not all of them were killed, but many of them were killed, and all the others were heavily traumatized, of course. What were the justifications of physicians, medical scientists to do this? They said to themselves, and we can see that in their internal communication, and also later when some of them were put to trial, that there were urgent medical questions which had to be solved, for instance, due to the war context, like the threat of epidemics, and to do something against the threat of epidemics, or the survival of wounded soldiers, etc., etc. So there were urgent questions in this specific historical context, the war context. And also there were research subjects available in these deregulated spaces, research subjects which were in the view of these physicians biologically or legally of minor value. So these were Jews, but also Polish resistance fighters, for instance, or Sinti and Roma, Gypsies, and others, and also mentally handicapped people. Another aspect of this kind of forced research is the use of cadavers and body specimens from victims of Nazi injustice, also political injustice, and also from other Nazi atrocities for teaching and research purposes. Well, so now let me turn to the post-war period, because much of our present-day assumptions about this Nazi period and medicine during the Nazi period is shaped by three central myths, as I would argue. Myths which have the function of exoneration of medicine in general. It's easy to keep to this myth, and then you have not to look into much further detail. You can acknowledge if there happened something very bad, but yeah. So the first myth is that medical atrocities were committed by a few fanatic Nazi doctors. They were the result of irrational ideologies imposed from outside Nazi politicians on apolitical physicians. So it's an easy answer, yeah? Politics is, so the culprit is responsible. Physicians in general, well, they had to do that, they were forced to do that, but most of them were, yeah, they were not really responsible for that. It's a myth, unfortunately. The second myth, the programs of mass sterilizations and patient killings were the expression of an ideology that had nothing to do with contemporary state-of-the-art medical reasoning and practice. It's a myth, unfortunately. Come back to that. And the third myth is that the activities of medical scientists experimenting on humans in these deregulated spaces were the expression of racial ideology or individual perversion of these physicians disguised as science and should therefore be called pseudoscience. Unfortunately, this is also a myth. It would be an easy explanation, but it's not true. So I just want to confront these myths with a bit of the historical evidence, just to show you that these are myths. The first myth, the historical evidence regarding the first myth would be that practically all atrocious activities in medical contexts, like the forced sterilization program, the patient killings, the forced human subject research, were initiated by physicians, not by politicians or political bodies. So the initiative did not come from outside of medicine, but they came from physicians themselves, unfortunately. This is highly irritating, but it raises a lot of questions. These were based on ideas, patterns of practice, and also value hierarchies, which may be identified well before 1933, after 1945, so outside of the Nazi context, and also in the international medical community, like the value hierarchy I've already mentioned, the priority for the collective good versus the individual good in public health. So these kind of value hierarchies, and there are other value hierarchies, which you can find there in an extreme and form, they are not specific for the Nazi context. Yeah, but there they became very manifest in a very, very extensive, extreme way. What we also see is the physicians responsible for these atrocities. These were not a few fanatic Nazis on the fringe of medicine, but there was the involvement of a considerable number of professors from university medical schools, of representatives of medical associations, and also representatives of research organizations and of international reputation. So these people who did these atrocities, who were responsible, they were no cranks and psychopaths. Well, the historical evidence in view of the second myth is that eugenics or racial hygiene, these terms were used more or less synonymously, which was the basis for the sterilization law, it was an international movement with origins in the late 19th century. So it was not invented by Nazi politicians. But it was this movement was initiated by the statistician, very famous statistician Francis Galton, a Brit, in 1883, and also by the physician Alfred Plötz, a German physician, a few years later. And around 1930, so even a few years before the Nazis took over, and internationally there existed numerous eugenically motivated sterilization laws, like in 20 US states, in California, for instance, Oregon, and so on, but also in Denmark, for instance, in 3 Canadian provinces, and so on. There were also eugenic associations all over the world, actually, in Scandinavia in particular, but in Europe, but also in Southern America, in Asia, and so on. And there were also eugenically motivated or inspired research institutes, which did research in what we would today call human genetics or medical genetics. One of the first one was actually in Cold Spring Harbor, a research facility which still exists today under another name for molecular biology, but it has its origins and there is a continuity in the work in this sort of eugenic context. Also, turning to the more radical program of cleansing the folk body, the killing of those considered unworthy of living, euthanasia. This was propagated by physicians and lawyers in Germany, but also in the United States or in Britain since the beginning of the 20th century. It is not specific for the German context, but again, in the German context, it was put into practice in a very extreme way. And in all 3 national contexts, Britain, the US, and in Germany, there existed even euthanasia societies with the goal to legalize the so-called mercy killing of life unworthy of living. So the historical evidence regarding the third myth is that it's regarding human subject research is that the research activities in these deregulated spaces were in part by internationally renowned biomedical scientists. Not only in that time, but some of them even had their post-war careers and were still in the post-war period internationally very highly considered. The research questions in many cases followed state-of-the-art medical knowledge. They were perceived as pressing in the context of war and also of racial policies. Similarly, the methods applied to answer these research questions were rational and coherent according to the standard of the time. In many cases, not in all cases, but in many cases. However, so the problem is not that the research questions were absurd or whatever, crazy, or that the methods were sort of inappropriate, but the problem with this kind of research is that the practices were reckless, frequently brutal, and in part deadly. So here we can see highly rational research, but completely dissociated from ethics in our sense, which was completely inhuman. And you can study that, for instance, in the sulfonamide experiments in the Ravensbrück concentration camp or the low-pressure experiments in the Dachau concentration camp, where actually the data were created to develop the ejection seat. And yesterday, Matwinya showed me that here there was a Stanley Aviation company which produced ejection seats for airplanes and bombers, but the data for this and the first ejection seats were actually built into prototypes of bombers in Germany after this kind of research. So it was very efficient, this kind of research, in a way, and the data was used later on in international contexts like here in the States. So let me turn to another aspect about, I have addressed it sort of implicitly already quite a bit. It's about the relationship between force or choice. Did physicians act out of force as a result of external force, or did they decide to do what they did? Had they some scope of action? Well, there's a very interesting number, which already gives a clue. And this is that between 55 and 65% of all German physicians in the Nazi period were members in the Nazi Party. This is very interesting numbers because it has two implications. It implies that roughly 40% of all German physicians were not members in the Nazi Party. My father, I have to admit, he was a physician and he was a member in the Nazi Party. When I asked him as a boy, have you been a member in the Nazi Party? He told me yes, but we had to enter, we had to join. There was no choice. Otherwise, something terrible would have happened. But it's not true. Yeah, it's a post-war to get rid of any further questions. But there was a scope of action, yeah, and the possibility of choice. But of course, in the face of very explicit expectations by those in power. But you can see that physicians, as others, took their decisions, and in part out of opportunism or because they thought, well, why shouldn't I do that? It might help me in my career, and so on and so on. So I think it's an interesting point. At what stage of sort of confrontation with things which you don't really think you should do you say really explicitly no, or when do you go with the expectations of those in power? I think it's a question which is relevant today. Another aspect of this number is that amongst physicians, the percentage of membership was as high as I mentioned, but it was much higher than in other academic professions, like lawyers or amongst teachers, because there you have a percentage of 25 or 30%. So that's a very significant difference, and it's in need of explanation. So, and it shows us that there is it's a clear evidence for a specific affinity of physicians towards the Nazi regime, more so than in other academic professions. I can't go into detail, perhaps we can do that later. So next question regarding the post-war period is where the attitudes, behavior patterns, and value hierarchies underlying the atrocities, so the preconditions, if you want, were they questioned in the post-World War II period amongst physicians in Germany or beyond? Well, many of the doctors involved in the atrocities also held prominent positions in the post-war medicine in Germany, and they were also quite well integrated in the international medical community. Not because everybody in the international community knew exactly what they had done, but they didn't ask. Although, in general, people knew that terrible things had happened. I mean, there was the Nuremberg medical trial where all this was sort of put to the public, and one could know, and one could have asked every individual colleague, but it was not done. Another aspect is that stigmatizing and debasing terms and conduct towards sick and disabled people, which legitimized the atrocious activities during the Nazi period, continued to be used by physicians in Germany and beyond to a considerable extent after 1945. And in the post-war period, another aspect, body and brain specimens originating from atrocities in the Nazi context were still used for teaching and research purposes at German university medical schools and the elite Max Planck institutes for brain research, for instance. And actually, as we just recently found out, a few colleagues of mine and myself, new specimens from euthanasia victims were also used in US contexts, interestingly. In the post-war period. And still another aspect is that medical eponyms honoring the physicians responsible for massive atrocities in the Nazi context are still in use today. You probably know that there are discussions about some of these eponyms, but it's an ongoing process, and for decades nobody asked if this person who gave the eponym to a disease or diagnostic procedure or whatever, if he was somehow related to the atrocities. Although one knew that this was a German physician working in the Nazi context, but nobody asked. So it was apparently it was not too relevant. Well, at So let's turn to behavior patterns in the post-war periods, which may be distinguished behavior patterns both of professional medical bodies and individual physicians to the medical atrocities. There was an early phase of trials and public debates, which lasted only very, very few years, actually until 1949, so just 3-4 years, and then it almost completely disappeared, these debates. And mostly, both in Germany but also internationally, as I've already indicated, there was no talk about that. Nobody wanted to talk about it. Nobody asked those who might have been responsible. People just looked away or looked into the future. There were exceptions, very few exceptions, mainly in the communities descending from the victims, in particular the Jewish community and the Polish community. You see that there are attempts to continue with the discussion. Another strategy was scapegoating. If someone was asked, a physician in Germany or a medical association, representatives of medical association, and they had to answer, they were asked by Jewish doctors or Polish doctors or by young people, students, then they said, well, those who were responsible were a few fanatic Nazi doctors. That's one of the myths, if you remember, or SS doctors. And also it was claimed that all atrocities happened because of political pressure by the Nazi state, Nazi ideology, or simply the Nazis. Again, outside pressures. But it's not what really happened. And then very late, actually, starting slowly in the 1980s, on the initiative of physicians and medical students at the margins of medicine, so not those presidents or boards of the medical associations, but physicians frequently working in psychiatric asylums and so on, or medical students, they started to ask and to do local histories. What happened in their surroundings, their local surroundings? So there was a kind of grassroots movement. And only from the early 2000s onwards, professional medical bodies started to systematically look into their own history in the Nazi period. Actually, the first medical association which did that was that of the psychiatrists. Okay, so I come to my end. There were also 3 basic ethical regimes or declarations formulated in response to medical atrocities during the Nazi period. And in looking at that, you might say that bioethical debates in the post-war period was some kind of triggered or very much shaped by responses to what happened in the Nazi period. Although, if you look more closely, you can see that it's, well, yeah, it was shaped, but in very different ways in different contexts. So the first document, ethical document, is the Nuremberg Code, which was proclaimed in 1947. It was the part of the final verdict in the Nuremberg medical trial, which was a very big publicized trial in Nuremberg. It lasted from December 46 to August 47, and together with the final verdict, there was this code proclaimed. It was only later called the Nuremberg Code. It was the first international formulation of principles for ethical research in human beings. Such a thing didn't exist before, interestingly, so it needed apparently these kind of atrocities and public debates. And it was, interestingly, this document was formulated by the court, by the lawyers, not by physicians. It is fairly strict, and this has had consequences in the following history, in the following years. So the main point is the necessity of voluntary informed consent in any case of human subject research. This is the main content, if you want. And it also implies the protection of captive groups, like prisoners, children in orphanages, etc. So in that sense, it's covering these captive groups or vulnerable groups, and it's very protective towards them. And this document was a reference point, became a reference point, although it was very much contested, but it was a reference point for later regulations, in particular the Declaration of Helsinki, which we have today as the relevant document on human subject research. But it was from physicians, the side of many physicians, it was perceived as too strict and also impractical, and it should be modified according to the needs of medical research. And we can see that in a minute. So the second document, which was emerging from these debates, was the Declaration of Geneva, which everybody knows as a physician. It was proclaimed by the World Medical Association, WMA, but the World Medical Association in itself was a response. The foundation or the establishment of the WMA was the result of the Nuremberg medical trial. It was established at the end of the trial in 1947, and it was established because representatives of professional medical associations were very worried about the loss of trust of the international public in medicine, in physicians, in the medical community, resulting from the medical atrocities which had become public in the Nuremberg medical trial. So they said, we have to do something against that threatening loss of trust. So they established the WMA, and the WMA, as one of the first activities, central activities, wanted to establish a code of conduct, if you want, or this declaration. The central norms of the Declaration of Geneva are direct responses to the medical atrocities as they were presented in the Nuremberg medical trial. So the core principle, I think, is that the health and well-being of the individual suffering human being should be the first priority of every healthcare professional. And this is in contrast to the kind of ethics which prevailed in the Nazi context, where the collective good was much more important than the individual good. Yeah? So here it was clearly expressed that the individual well-being is of the highest priority. And the second important point, which is a direct response to what happened in the Nazi context, is that the behavior of the physician should not be influenced by considerations of race, social background, religion, etc., which is a response to what has happened in the Nazi context, in particular regarding the healthcare of Jews, of gypsies, and of those considered as hereditarily ill. So you can see this document is a clear response, both on an organizational level, but also regarding the content to what happened in the Nazi period. And then we have the Declaration of Helsinki, which is another document of the WMA, specifically addressing human subject research. It was proclaimed only in 1964, although already in the beginning of the WMA, in 47, 48, they wanted to publish such a document, but they couldn't agree on it. So there was a high sort of degree of dissensus and heated debates, and actually a colleague of mine has shown a few years back that the American Medical Association and also the pharmaceutical industry successfully argued and pressed to weaken the principles of the Nuremberg Nuremberg Code, which I told you were very strict. So they pressed and successfully pressed to weaken, in particular, the principle of informed consent. The Declaration of Helsinki distinguished between non-therapeutic and therapeutic research, and for therapeutic research, the requirements were sort of weakened regarding informed consent in the case of, for instance, in clinical trials. So it was possible in some cases to do research without informed consent, and also the declaration bracketed out references to captive groups, which were contained in the Nuremberg Code. So it's an interesting case. It's on the one side, it is a document resulting from debates after the Nuremberg medical trial, but on the other side, it also shows us that these kind of ethical documents are the result of complicated negotiations, and they are compromises. And in these compromises, you find also traces of in a way, interests of professional groups and even economics, like pharmaceutical industry. Okay, in conclusion, the massive atrocities in medicine during the Nazi period were not the activities of individual isolated fanatized doctors, but rather they took place with a substantial participation of leading representatives of the medical community and medical institutions. Highly irritating, I think, and it also creates lots of stimuli for further considerations. Almost all of the atrocities were initiated by physicians, not by political authorities. However, the Nazi state created the infrastructure to put the underlying ideas and resulting medical initiatives into a radical practice. So without the Nazi context, this could not have happened. This is quite clear. So this constellation may be described as a collusion, playing together between medicine and the Nazi state, in which both spheres, politics and medicine, represented resources for each other. So it's not the case, I want to really stress that what happened was the result of only of outside pressure on medicine, not. The underlying ideas, attitudes, and value hierarchies creating the conditions for the medical atrocities were not specific for the Nazi period, as I said, but this period rather showed their extreme manifestations. And also, I hope I have shown this, the historical knowledge was the starting point and reference for ethical debates and declarations, and also a fairly late systematic self-reflection in the medical profession. Thank you.
So I
had the clock is only there, so I had no possibility to check where
I'm relying on Lisa to tell me when we're coming towards closing time, but otherwise I've got dozens of questions.
After that.
Okay. So I want to start at the end. You briefly alluded to the fact. Can you use the mic? Yes. Sorry. I would like to start with something you alluded to towards the end, which is the experience of the German psychiatric profession, which you said was the first of the many specialties involved to go through a process of self-examination. Why did that happen, and what was the result? I can only imagine that they were very deeply involved in many of these programs. There must have been some pushback to initiating that process.
Yes, this is a very interesting topic, actually, question. Thank you. Yes, there were attempts by some critical physicians, psychiatrists, and others in their respective medical associations to bring the associations to this kind of self-reflection, self-examination. But they were all sort of averted, and internal documentation and also some leaks did show us, as medical historians, we can reconstruct that there were concerns about loss of reputation. If something bad would come out of this kind of self-examination, this might lead to a loss of reputation and loss of trust. So these associations, they were very worried about that, and they said, no, we don't want to do that. And in particular, we don't want to spend much money for that, with a very problematic potential result. So, but in the psychiatric association, the debates were a little bit more intensive because they were particularly concerned because they were involved in the patient killings and so. And also, perhaps psychiatrists are a little bit more politically critical. So I don't know. This might be speculation, but it's also depended on individuals in the board and the individual president at that time, in 2009, actually, when this started. So they provided resources for a historical examination, for an independent historical examination from outside. And this resulted in a public apology of the association, which was met with high interest in the public and very positive resonance. There was a monograph published after a few years of research. An exhibition was created which toured through Germany, but also in the States and in Japan and in Australia and so on, an exhibition about psychiatrists during the Nazi period. And the result was there is very, very positive reaction in the public because the public acknowledged this kind of transparency and self-critique. And actually, this created more trust towards psychiatrists. So when the other medical associations realized that what they thought would happen, that didn't occur, but the contrary happened, the opposite happened, they also started to do that. So now we have an interesting process where all the medical specialties or associations, from internal medicine, surgery, dentists, urologists, and so on and so on, it's really interesting, pathologists, they all started their historical projects. And so it turned completely around. Worries about reputation were put aside, and now there's a new kind of transparency.
And that's time.
Oh, sorry, that's my fault.
We have, on the other hand, we have a couple of opportunities that we should let folks know about. So if you are interested in speaking more with Professor Roelcke, he will be giving grand rounds on Wednesday at the Department of Medicine. This is open to the general public. Anyone can sign up and listen in on grand rounds. And that's at noon. And then at 1:30, so directly after grand rounds, he'll be at the Fulgenetti Pavilion for an hour or so. We'll see how long we can keep you. And anyone is welcome to join us there. It'll be just an open discussion. Are there any other announcements I should be making before we close out? That is it. Thank you all for being here in person. Thank you for everyone who was able to join us online. I will say, by the way, if you were online and you were unable to get a question in, because no one was able to get a question in, we will collect the questions in the Q&A and put together a document that addresses some of the questions.
Address me directly per email or so, and I will be happy to answer questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah.